Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm talking to you from my house this time. We're going to split up the immune system notes into two different screencasts because it actually takes a little bit more than 10 minutes, and I can only record 10 minutes at a time. So we'll do what are called the first and second lines of defense in this first screencast, and then we'll do the immune system, which is the third line of defense, in the second screencast. All right, so we're going to start out with how the body fights disease, give you a quick background information. Our bodies are always full of bacteria and viruses. So how is it that scientists can tell which of these bacteria or viruses is causing a particular disease? It turns out that that's phenomenally complicated. Keep in mind that your body has about 100 trillion cells in it, and you have more bacteria than that. So how do we know which of the bacteria is actually causing an illness or which of the viruses are causing an illness? So there's a famous German physician named Robert Koch who designed the following procedure, and we still use that procedure today. Number one, the suspected pathogen has to occur in the body of an animal with the disease and not occur in a body of a healthy animal. The trick is actually being able to prove that it's in one body and not the other. That's difficult. All right, number two, the suspected pathogen should be isolated. That means that you take it and then you grow it in a tissue culture, in a laboratory culture. So that means basically grow it in a petri dish if you can. Number three, if a healthy animal is inoculated with this culture, that means you scoop it out of the petri dish, put it in an injection and inject it into the animal. The animal that was healthy should now develop the disease. And then number four, the pathogen from the second animal who was originally healthy and then you gave it the shot should be isolated and grown in the laboratory. It should be the same as the pathogen from the first animal. And then you know you probably have the right pathogen. Wow, that's easier said than done. It's pretty tricky stuff. All right, let's go ahead and talk about pathogens and antigens, what exactly the word pathogen means. A pathogen is anything that causes disease. So pathogens can be viruses, it can be bad bacteria. Remember that your intestine is full of bacteria that actually help. Some help you digest, some help you make vitamins, and some don't really care about you at all. They don't help you or harm you, but they take up space so that the bad guys can't invade. So really, there's only a tiny percentage of bacteria that actually make us sick. So that's why we have to call them bad bacteria. And then parasites can also be pathogens. We're going to contrast the word pathogen with the word antigen. An antigen is usually found on the surface of a pathogen. So sometimes those two words are interchangeable. An antigen is actually a protein that the immune system recognizes as foreign. So the immune system, remember, doesn't have eyeballs. The white blood cells can't look around for an invader. What they're doing is touching every single cell in your body, and every single cell that it encounters, it's testing to see if the proteins on the surface are familiar or not. And whenever a white blood cell encounters foreign proteins, aka antigens, it attacks them. Now that works great if you're talking about the foreign proteins on the outside of a virus or the foreign proteins on the outside of a bacteria. When it becomes kind of a hassle, though, is when the white blood cells encounter the foreign proteins on the surface of a transplanted organ. That makes transplanting organs really difficult. We talk about being a tissue match with somebody. That means that the proteins have to be really similar. We try to trick the immune system into accepting somebody else's kidney as our own. We also have to the person who is receiving that transplant has to take immunosuppressant drugs, which suppress the immune system so that it's not quite as aware of the differences between the two proteins. There we go. Unfortunately, that means that people who take or who receive transplanted organs are more likely to get sick. So that's kind of a disadvantage. All right, let's talk about your first line of defense. Actually, just really quickly, we did this in class. I'm not going to spend much time on these little quizzes. Is a healthy transplanted kidney a pathogen, an antigen, or both? It is an antigen. It is foreign, but because we're telling you that it's healthy, we don't consider that a pathogen. So it would be an antigen because it's foreign. All right, now let's talk about what's called your first line of defense or your non-specific immunities. These are things you kind of learned about in elementary school. For example, you know that your skin protects you from everything. And when you get a boo-boo, like you did when you were in kindergarten, you have to clean it out so that bacteria and other things don't get into your body. So non-specific immunity refers to the body's defenses which protect it against all pathogens. Other things included in non-specific immunity include mucous membranes, your snot, that, stomach acid that eats away any germs that you might be ingesting in your food, earwax, sweat, fevers. We're going to talk a little bit more about fevers in just a moment. All right, moving on, let's talk about what are referred to as the second lines of defense. And there's a few categories in these second lines of defense. This is when your first line of defense gets penetrated, maybe your skin gets cut and some bugs make it in through your skin, what have you. We'll talk about that. There's three important cells that we'll talk about in the second lines of defense. First of all are the macrophages. The term macrophage means big eater. And they come by, and whenever somebody penetrates through the skin, they come by and they can engulf it. They're kind of like giant vacuum cleaners. You're going to run into the macrophages in the third line of defense as well, but we're introducing them here as a second line of defense. Other immune cells that we'll come in contact with or that we will discuss right now, the neutrophils. Neutrophils are sometimes referred to as kamikazes. That's because they release a bleach-like chemical that basically destroys all cellular life in the area, including themselves. But it's pretty effective at getting rid of any cells that might be reproducing a virus, for example, or getting rid of bacteria that are in the area. Another example of sort of a general cell are the natural killer cells. They release a chemical called perforin, or an enzyme, I should say, that pokes holes in infected cells, cancer cells and virus-infected cells. So these are both examples of white blood cells that are not tailor-made to a very specific disease. They're more general killers. I will point out at this point that to really understand the immune system, you would have to have an MD or a PhD, many, many more years of schooling. And I'm trying to do this in about 15 minutes. So I'm skipping lots and lots of white blood cells, and I'm giving you just really quick introductions to a few of the white blood cells. What they do is, in fact, a lot more complicated. But these are the things I expect you to know. The macrophages are the big eaters, the neutrophils are the kamikazes, and the natural killer cells poke holes in virus-infected or cancer cells. All right, other parts of the second line of defense often is referred to as the inflammatory response. The inflammatory response occurs when a pathogen penetrates through the skin or the mucous membranes. In the diagram below, you're looking at a splinter, for example. So you get something that pushes through the skin. The skin, the cells that make up the skin, the epidermal cells, rip open when you get a splinter or a cut or you skin your knee or whatever. And when they rip open, they release a chemical called histamine. And histamine, strangely enough, increases the flow of blood to the area. You would think it would be just the opposite. You would think that histamine would want to reduce the flow of blood to the area, but histamine increases the flow of blood to area to draw additional white blood cells. This causes fluid and white blood cells to rush to the area. It makes your boo-boo feel hot and warm and swollen. Hot and warm is the same thing. And look red. Anyway, you get the idea. Pus might form at this point. But the reason we've increased the blood flow there is to get those white blood cells, the WBCs, to come in and destroy or eat up those pathogens. So that's called the inflammatory response. All right, and the last thing in this section, the other non-specific defenses, these are things, again, that your body reacts to all pathogens in the same way. The first one is interferon. Interferon is a chemical that's released by virus-infected cells. So when they get invaded, they start releasing this interferon, and it warns neighboring cells that there's a virus in the area. And then the neighboring cells start to produce an enzyme that slows down the viral synthesis or the building of viruses. So the question is, why don't we always release interferon if it slows down viruses? And hopefully from our DNA unit, you remember, we don't want to produce things all the time if not necessary because it wastes energy. So we wait until we actually have a virus infection and then our bodies release interferon. The other one that we'll mention, we've talked about this in the past, fevers, obviously is when the body's temperature rises, but it turns out fevers, low-grade fevers are actually healthy for us. Low-grade fevers stimulate our immune system to divide a little bit faster, and they inhibit the growth of certain bacteria and viruses. So it actually slows down the illness process. So a low-grade fever can be healthy for us. As long as we're not feeling too miserable, it's not bad to have a fever. High-grade fevers, as you know, roughly 108 degrees is when the proteins start to denature, and that's when it becomes dangerous. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop here, and then we'll start the other set of notes in just a moment. I'm having trouble shutting down. Give me just a second here.